At 82 years old, Billie Jean King walked across a stage that looked nothing like center court. There was no grass beneath her feet, no white tennis dress, no roar from Wimbledon, no opponent standing across the net, waiting for her to miss. Just a cap, a gown, a history degree. And maybe that was why the moment felt so tender, because this was not the kind of victory the world usually remembered her for. This was not another Grand Slam, not another photograph of Billie holding a trophy, not another headline calling her a champion, a pioneer, a legend. This was quieter than all of that, smaller maybe, to anyone watching from the outside. But to Billie, it meant something. She had started college in 1961 when she was still young enough to believe that life might unfold in a straight line. Study, play tennis, grow up, become somebody. But life had other plans. Tennis pulled her forward. The world pulled her into battles she never asked for but somehow seemed born to face. And for more than 6 decades, that unfinished promise waited in the background. A book left open. A sentence never completed. And then, at 82, she finished it. That is where this story begins. Not with a baby being born, not with a perfect childhood, not with destiny wrapped in golden light. It begins with an old dream finally kept. Because Billie Jean King's life was never just about winning. It was about noticing. Long before the world called her brave, she was just a girl from Long Beach, California, watching carefully. She noticed who got the best courts. She noticed who received attention. She noticed who was expected to lead and who was expected to smile politely from the side. She was born Billie Jean Moffett in 1943, into a working family where toughness was not a speech. It was a way of living. Her father was a firefighter. Her mother worked hard at home. There was no royal road waiting for Billie, no glamorous beginning. No one handed her a racket and said, "Here, child, go change the world." She had to find the door herself, and once she found tennis, she fell in love with it fast. The rhythm, the movement, the clean sound of the ball, the feeling that, inside those painted lines, effort could become proof. But even there, inside a game she loved, Billie saw the unfairness. She saw that tennis was not just about talent, it was about access, it was about class, it was about who belonged at certain clubs and who did not. It was about race, money, gender, manners, and invisible rules that nobody wanted to explain out loud. For a young girl with sharp eyes, that kind of thing does something to you. Some people see unfairness and learn to accept it. Billie saw it and became restless. She did not yet have the language for everything she was feeling. She was not standing at a podium making speeches. She was not leading organizations. She was not facing television cameras. She was only a girl with a racket in her hand and a question growing inside her. Why should the world be built this way? That question would follow her for the rest of her life. It followed her when she trained. It followed her when she won. It followed her when men were praised as professionals and women were treated like ornaments. It followed her when prize money told the truth more brutally than any insult could, because money has a way of revealing what people really value. Billie understood that early. She understood that applause was not enough. Compliments were not enough. Being called talented was not enough if the system still told women they were worth less, and that is what made her different. She was not fighting because she hated men. She was not fighting because she wanted attention. She was fighting because she had seen too many women taught to shrink themselves before they even knew how tall they could stand. Even as a teenager, there was something in Billie that refused to shrink. She wanted to be the best tennis player in the world, yes, but somewhere beneath that dream was another one, even larger. She wanted the game to make room, not just for her, for others, for girls who would come after her and never know her personally, but would live inside doors she helped force open. That kind of courage does not arrive all at once. It begins in small moments. A girl looking around and realizing the boys are treated differently. A young athlete hearing people praise women softly and pay them poorly. A future champion understanding that silence is also a choice. Billie Jean King did not become Billie Jean King in one famous match. She became herself in the years before anyone was watching closely, in the practice sessions, in the doubts. In the quiet anger, she learned to turn into discipline. in the lonely awareness that if she wanted fairness, she might have to demand it before the world was ready to give it. And that is the part people sometimes miss. Before the trophies, before the battle of the sexes, before the Women's Tennis Association, before the speeches and honors and medals, there was a girl who simply knew something was wrong. She knew women deserved more, and once Billie Jean King knew something, she could not unknow it. That was her gift, and sometimes it was also her burden. Billie Jean King did not ask for equality like someone asking for a favor. She demanded it like someone pointing to a truth that had been sitting in plain sight for years. By the early 1970s, she was already one of the finest tennis players alive. She had the trophies, she had the skill, she had the discipline. But the sport still treated women as if their greatness came with a discount. Men played for money that could build a life. Women played for checks that often felt like a polite thank you note, and Billie saw it clearly. The insult was not always shouted. Sometimes it was printed on a prize sheet. Sometimes it appeared in the size of a locker room, the placement of a court, the tone of a reporter's question. Sometimes it was in the way people praised women for being graceful while paying men for being powerful. She could have accepted it. Many people wanted her to. They wanted women to be grateful just to be allowed on the stage. Smile, play, don't make trouble, don't talk about money, don't make the men uncomfortable. But Billie knew money was never only money. Money was respect. Money was proof. Money told young girls whether their dreams had value. In 1970, when the gap between men's and women's prize money became impossible to ignore, Billie and 8 other women took a dangerous step. They became known as the Original Nine. They risked their careers, challenged the tennis establishment, and helped build a new path for women's professional tennis. It was not glamorous. It was not easy. It was rebellion dressed in tennis whites. They signed symbolic $1 contracts and chose uncertainty over humiliation. That detail still carries weight. $1. Not because their work was worth $1, but because they were betting on a future the world had not agreed to yet. They were saying, in effect, we will not wait to be invited into fairness. We will create it ourselves. Billie was not alone, and she never liked pretending she was, but she became one of the clearest voices in the room. She understood pressure. She understood publicity. She understood that if women's tennis was going to survive, it needed more than talent. It needed structure. It needed sponsors. It needed a tour. It needed women willing to sit in hotel rooms, argue over details, answer critics, and keep going when the whole thing looked fragile. Then came 1973. On the eve of Wimbledon, around 60 women players gathered at the Gloucester Hotel in London. Out of that meeting came the Women's Tennis Association, with Billie Jean King as its first president. It was more than an organization. It was a declaration. The women were no longer scattered voices asking separately for dignity. They were a body, a force, a union of athletes who finally had a way to speak together. That same year, Billie pushed the US Open toward equal prize money. She had won the US Open in 1972, but received less than the men's champion. And she made it clear she would not return the next year unless the pay was equal. In 1973, the US Open became the first Grand Slam tournament to offer equal prize money to men and women. Think about the nerve that took, not just to win, but to threaten absence. To understand that sometimes a woman's power is not only in showing up, but in refusing to show up under insulting terms. For older women watching her then, and for older women remembering her now, that fight may feel familiar. Maybe they did not play tennis. Maybe they raised children, worked offices, taught school, waited tables, balanced books, cared for husbands, buried parents, swallowed comments, accepted smaller paychecks and kept moving. Billie's battle belonged to them too. She was not simply arguing over a tournament purse. She was saying what many women had been thinking in silence. Our time matters. Our labor matters. Our excellence matters. And the beautiful thing is, she did not need to become cold to do it. She could be fierce and still human. She could be strategic and still wounded. She could stand in front of men with money and power and still carry the private ache of being doubted again and again. That is why her legacy does not feel like a statue. It feels alive. Because every time a woman athlete receives equal prize money, every time a girl watches a professional match and believes the court belongs to her too, part of that road leads back to Billie Jean King and those women who decided that waiting was no longer enough. Before the most famous match of her life, before the world watched her face Bobby Riggs, Billie had already fought a quieter battle, a battle over worth. And she had already proved something the world should have known all along. Women were not asking to be given greatness. They were asking people to stop pretending they could not see it. By the time Billie Jean King stepped into the Houston Astrodome on September 20th, 1973, the match had already become bigger than tennis. That was the danger. Bobby Riggs was 55 years old, a former champion, a gambler, a showman, and a man who understood publicity almost too well. He had already beaten Margaret Court earlier that year, and after that his taunts became louder. He claimed women's tennis was weaker. He played the clown, but the joke was not harmless. Behind the spectacle was an old insult dressed up for television. Billie understood that. She was 29, still in her prime, and she knew exactly what people would say if she lost. They would not simply say Bobby Riggs had beaten Billie Jean King. They would say a man past his prime had proven something about all women. They would use one night to mock a whole movement. That was the weight on her shoulders. More than 30,000 people filled the Astrodome, and millions more watched on television. The event had circus energy, almost absurd in places. Billie entered like Cleopatra, carried in with theatrical flair. Riggs arrived with his own performance, smiling, playing to the cameras, enjoying the noise. It could have looked silly from far away. But inside Billie, it was not silly. She later said she felt that if she did not win, it could set women back for years. That was not drama. That was the emotional truth of the night. Women across America were watching from living rooms, kitchens, bars, nursing homes, college dorms, and small houses where nobody had ever called them equal without adding a condition. Billie Jean King calm. So Billie did what champions do when the world is loud. She became calm. She did not try to overpower the moment. She outthought it. She moved Riggs. She changed pace. She played with patience, discipline, and a kind of cold intelligence that made all his joking look smaller with every game. The match was not close in the way his supporters had hoped. Billie beat him in straight sets, 6-4, 6-3, 6-3, Billie Jean King calm. And when it was over, the scoreboard said one thing, but the silence around the insult said another. For so many women, that victory felt personal. It was not because they hated men. It was because they were tired. Tired of being underestimated in public and overused in private. Tired of being told to be patient. Tired of being asked to prove the obvious again and again. Billie had not solved every injustice in one night. No match could do that. But she had protected something fragile. Confidence. She had given women a picture they could keep. A woman under impossible pressure, standing in the center of a stadium built for spectacle, refusing to break. She did not just defeat Bobby Riggs. She defeated the easy laugh, the cheap comment, the smug certainty that women could be talented, but never truly powerful. And maybe that is why people still remember that night, not because it was fair to place so much on one woman. It was not, but because Billie carried it anyway. She walked into that stadium knowing she was playing for more than herself, and she walked out having given millions of women a little more room to breathe. That was the victory. Not just the score, the breath. The world loved Billie Jean King when her courage was useful. That is one of the hardest truths in her story. When she beat Bobby Riggs, people cheered. When she fought for equal prize money, women stood taller. When she helped build the Women's Tennis Association, she became more than an athlete. She became a banner, a symbol. A woman who could stand in front of cameras and say what millions of women had felt, but had not always been allowed to say. But symbols are not allowed to be messy. That was the cruel part. The public wanted Billie strong, clear, fearless, easy to admire. They wanted the champion who could speak about equality in a way that made everyone feel proud. But they were less prepared for Billie the person. Billie with confusion. Billie with private pain. Billie with a marriage under strain. Billie with questions about herself she had carried quietly for years. By 1981, she had already given so much of herself to the world. that people forgot she still had a private life to protect. Then that private life was pulled into the open. Her former partner, Marilyn Barnett, filed a palimony lawsuit, and suddenly Billie's personal life became public property. The details were discussed in newspapers, in conversations, in rooms where people did not know her and did not care how much it hurt. Billie was not given the gentle space to speak when she was ready. She was pushed into the light before the world had learned how to be kind, and that light was harsh. This was not 2026. This was not a time when public figures could expect understanding. This was 1981. For many people then, especially in sports, being openly gay or bisexual was treated like scandal, not truth. There was judgment in the air, fear, mockery. Sponsors worried about image, agents worried about money. People who had applauded her bravery in one arena became nervous when that bravery touched something more personal. Billie could have denied everything. Some people wanted her to. It would have been easier, at least for business. Easier for brands. Easier for the clean public story. Easier for the people around her who wanted the storm to pass quickly. But Billie did not build her life by choosing easy. She admitted the relationship. Not because the moment was fair. It was not. Not because she had been given a graceful path. She had not. She told the truth under pressure, and the truth cost her. She lost endorsements. She lost money. She lost some of the comfort that fame had finally brought. And maybe worse than that, she lost the illusion that the world's admiration was unconditional. That is a different kind of loneliness. To stand in front of the public after years of fighting for women, only to realize that many people loved your courage only when it stayed within boundaries they approved of. Billie had spent so much of her life asking society to expand. Expand the court, expand the prize money, expand the idea of what women could be. But now she was asking, without even wanting to ask, for people to expand their idea of her, not just champion, human. There is a particular pain in being judged by strangers for something that took you years to understand inside yourself. Billie had married young. She had lived inside expectations. She had tried to be the woman other people could recognize. Wife, athlete, leader, public figure, role model. But identity is not always a straight road. Sometimes it arrives slowly, through confusion, tenderness, guilt, fear, and finally a kind of exhausted honesty. She paid for that honesty in public, and still, she kept going. That is the part that matters most. The scandal did not end her. The headlines did not erase her. The sponsors could walk away, but they could not take the years she had already given to the game. They could not take Wimbledon. They could not take the US Open. They could not take the girls who had watched her and learned to stop apologizing for wanting more. But pain leaves marks even on strong people. Billie Jean King was not made of stone. She had feelings. She had shame pressed onto her by a world that should have known better. She had to rebuild parts of herself while everyone watched, and she had to do it while still carrying the title that had followed her everywhere. Pioneer. People say that word as if it is clean and noble, and sometimes it is. But being a pioneer can also mean walking first through the sharpest glass. It can mean bleeding before others are allowed to walk safely. Billie did not choose the timing of that public exposure. But she chose what came after it. She chose not to disappear. She chose not to let one painful chapter define the whole book. She chose slowly and imperfectly to keep becoming free. That is why her story cannot be told as a simple tragedy. Because yes, there was humiliation. Yes, there was loss. Yes, there were nights when the applause must have felt very far away. But there was also survival. A woman who had been turned into a symbol by the public had to fight for the right to be seen as a person. Not perfect, not untouchable, not always certain, just real. And maybe that is what made Billie Jean King even more powerful in the end. Not that she never broke, but that after the world tried to turn her private pain into a public spectacle, she kept walking forward anyway. For years, people looked at Billie Jean King and saw control. They saw the footwork, the timing, the eyes that could read a court before the ball even landed. But control on a tennis court does not mean control everywhere. Away from the cameras, Billie carried a struggle that did not come with a scoreboard. She has spoken publicly about binge eating disorder, about therapy, and about the daily work of naming the problem instead of pretending it was gone. In one interview, she said she still reminds herself that she has an eating disorder because recovery is not a trophy you win once and place on a shelf. It is something you keep facing. Katie Couric.com. That is what makes this part of her life so human. Billie could stand in a stadium and carry the expectations of millions, but still wake up with a private voice inside her head, a voice arguing over food, over body, over worth, over shame. The kind of voice that does not care how many trophies you won. And for women who grew older inside a world that judged every pound, every wrinkle, every change in the body, that confession matters. Because aging is not just physical, it is emotional. It asks a person to make peace with the body that survived everything, the knees that hurt, the energy that shifts, the mirror that tells the truth without asking permission. Billie has also dealt with health and mobility challenges, including knee surgeries, and later returned to hitting tennis balls after many years away from the court. Even then, the story was not about pretending to be young. It was about staying connected to joy, to movement, to the game that had shaped her life. Self.com. That is the quieter courage of Billie Jean King, not the courage of defeating a man in front of millions, the courage of telling the truth about a disorder, the courage of going to therapy, the courage of aging without disappearing, the courage of admitting that even champions need help. And maybe that is why she still reaches people, because Billie never asked to be remembered as perfect. She only kept showing us what it looks like to continue. At 82, Billie Jean King stood in a place that brought her life full circle. Not at Wimbledon, not at the US Open, not in the Houston Astrodome where she once carried the hopes of women on her back. This time, she stood at a commencement ceremony in Los Angeles, wearing a cap and gown, waiting to receive a Bachelor of Arts degree in history from Cal State LA. She had first enrolled there in 1961, when she was still Billie Jean Moffitt, a young woman with a racket, a restless mind, and a future too large to fit inside one classroom. She left before finishing, pulled away by tennis and by the movement she would help build. More than 6 decades later, on May 18, 2026, she returned to complete what had been left unfinished. There was something almost poetic about the subject. History, because Billie had not just studied it, she had lived inside it. She had changed it. She had been a girl who noticed unfairness before she had the power to name it. She had become a champion who understood that trophies were not enough if women were still treated as less valuable. She had helped create the Women's Tennis Association. She had pushed the US Open toward equal prize money. She had walked into the battle of the sexes and carried pressure most people could never survive. And still, after all of that, there remained this one quiet piece of her life: a degree. To some people, that might seem small compared with 39 Grand Slam titles, compared with statues, honors, awards, and a name known around the world. But unfinished dreams do not become meaningless just because a person becomes successful. Sometimes they grow more tender with time. They sit in the heart, waiting. Billie's degree was not about proving she was smart. She had proved that 1,000 times. It was about keeping a promise to herself. That is why this final scene matters so much for an older audience. Because by 82, many people have learned that life does not always happen in the correct order. Some dreams get delayed by work, by children, by bills, by illness, by fear, by survival, by the simple fact that the world needed something from you before you had finished becoming yourself. Billie knew that feeling. She had spent her life opening doors for others, but this door had remained open behind her. Then she walked through it, and the timing made it even more powerful. In April 2025, just a year earlier, Billie received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, becoming the first woman honored in the sports entertainment category. Her star, the 807th on the Walk of Fame, was placed near Hollywood and Vine, and the ceremony recognized not only her tennis career, but the way she turned sport into a public stage for equality. Hollywood gave her a star. Cal State LA gave her a degree. But the deeper gift was this: Billie Jean King, after everything, was still moving forward. That is the emotional truth of her story. She was never only the woman who won. She was the woman who continued, through pressure, through judgment, through private pain, through aging, through a body that changed, a world that changed, and battles that did not end just because the cameras stopped rolling. Her life does not ask us to pity her. It asks us to respect the distance she traveled, because Billie Jean King was not destroyed by the weight placed on her. She carried it, questioned it, fought it, and then kept finding new ways to live beyond it. At 82, with a degree in her hands, she was not saying goodbye to the world. She was not closing the curtain. She was reminding people that becoming is not reserved for the young. There is still time. Time to finish the class. Time to make the call. Time to forgive yourself. Time to begin again. Time to complete the promise that waited quietly while life demanded everything else. And maybe that is why the image of Billie in a cap and gown feels more moving than another trophy. A trophy says, "I beat someone." A degree, after 65 years, says something else. "I came back." For Billie Jean King, that return was not a footnote. It was a final note of grace in a life still being written. The champion who once fought to prove that women deserved equal space had taken one more step, not for cameras, not for prize money, not for a crowd demanding history. This one was for the young woman who had started in 1961, the young woman who left, the older woman who returned, and the world that got to witness both.